Okay, voila. It is April 27th. It's Monday. This is again the weekend update, but technically I'm doing it on Mondays now. And this is going to be for both U.S. history and then I've got the one world history class, so I'll do that one at the end. Hope everyone's doing well. Had some nice weather this weekend, and it feels like we're getting close to summertime, so that's kind of fun. And we're getting some good news in terms of the pandemic, the COVID-19. Obviously, if you look at some of the more bearish or bad news, you're going to keep looking at number of deaths, morbidity, and mortality. But the trend is showing that it's slowing down, and the overall numbers are a lot lower than we thought, especially on the deaths. At this point, it may not even reach what seasonal flu is. So that's great news. I'm sure that you guys are looking forward to having what I'd call an authentic summer, not one where we're locked up. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Okay, so let's get into what's going on this week in U.S. history. So we are wrapping up the Cold War, and we're going to step back and look at civil rights. So when we think about the Cold War, we're thinking more about foreign policy. So what's the United States position in terms of capitalism, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, as well as federalism, which is our republic, democratic values, versus at the time the evil empire, which was the USSR, also known as Russia, which was a communist dictatorship. So while that was happening, that starts at the end of World War II, and we have proxy wars, and then we have an arms race. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you read about. We have Sputnik, a few other things that we're fighting against the Soviets. We're kind of trying to show that our way of life is better than the communists. And at the same time, in so that's the late 1940s and 1950s, that's a foreign policy stance. At the same time, in the United States, the domestic issue is going to be civil rights. And civil rights is going to be this idea that it's had a subtext throughout the whole year. When we talked about the signing of the Constitution, originally we looked at that Three-Fifths Compromise, which was somewhat of a conundrum because Southern states owned slaves, and they weren't going to become part of this new union unless there was some sort of a compromise. And so we spent some time talking about the Three-Fifths Compromise. Not a good compromise, kind of one of those things where they were just kicking the can down the road. Now, this leads into the Civil War, 1860, 1861 to 1865, which kind of fixes that problem of slavery. And obviously, I don't want to get into the semantics of it was states' rights versus slavery, but once the Civil War starts, a year or so in, Lincoln declares with the Emancipation Proclamation that yes, slavery is going to be abolished. And at the end of Civil War, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. If you recall, this illustrates that African American men, focus on men, get the right to vote, they're citizens, etc. As we move from the late 1860s into the 1950s, 90 years, on paper, it shows that African Americans, Latinos, and other minorities are equal, but it's not really happening in application. That's just on paper. So what we're going to look at now is there's going to be a lot of reasons for the kind of the genesis of this civil rights movements. But one of the main reasons is we studied this, you had African American men fighting in World War II for freedom, and they're fighting against fascism. And when they come back to the United States, they're hopeful that idealistically society has changed. And what they find is nothing's changed. They're still second-class citizens. So we're going to take this journey over the next few weeks into the civil rights movement. And that civil rights movement is initially going to be driven by African Americans and specifically African American men, but then it's going to spill into others. You're going to see Latino rights, Asian American rights, with a women's rights movement, and eventually that's going to unravel into gay rights. So we're going to see a lot of these minorities fighting for their piece of the American dream. So follow with me, if you will, this journey of civil rights. It's one of those pieces that's always kind of unraveling in this country. It's never quite done. I have a daughter with autism, and she's part of a group. It's also a minority group right now who's fighting for rights. So people with disabilities are fighting for rights, and we're going to kind of look at that. In the 1990s, there's a big push for disability rights. Okay, so that's the journey we're going on in terms of civil rights. What you're going to be watching, okay, you're going to be watching A Class Divided. Okay, it's 50 minutes long, 48 minutes long or something. And it's really, if you can fast forward through it. I can't stop you, distance learning, but I would challenge you to try to watch it because it's really quite impactful. And it's something that if you take a psychology class or another social science class in college, you're going to see this study. And they take some elementary school kids, and they separate them by either eye color or hair color or height. And it's really interesting to see how the more powerful group begins to treat the minority group. Interesting stuff. So please take a look at A Class Divided. And there's a graphic organizer that goes with it. You also have an introductory reading in the textbook, pages 520 to 526, with the 5 questions at the end. Okay, so that's U.S. history. If you're in my U.S. history class, you don't have to watch any further. But if you want to know what we're doing in world history, you can continue to listen. So world history, we're going to be wrapping up the Cold War II, but we're looking at it a little bit differently than from the U.S. history. We're looking at it from kind of a global perspective. How did this Cold War change overall foreign policy, hegemony, who ended up winning, and how did this create, it's really going to pivot and push us into what we call globalization. We're going to look at how China was kind of rebuilt and how the Soviet Union fell and Russia, for maybe a decade, struggles, but now they come back and they're incredibly powerful. But I'm getting the cart in front of the horse. First, we got to kind of wrap up the Cold War. And we're going to wrap up the Cold War. You're going to read Topic 8, Lesson 5, which is kind of generic, but it gives you the soup to nuts why spoiler alert, why the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. But I'm also going to have you watch 2 short videos, and there's a graphic organizer that goes with them. One is a PBS NewsHour, and they kind of show just it all unraveling in the Soviet Union. Just there's a great shot in there where a Russian man, lays down in front of a tank, and the tank's going to run him over. I don't want to tell you what's going to happen because I don't want to spoil it, but watch, it's good. And then you're going to also kind of juxtapose out with a TED Ed, which is called The Rise and Fall of the Berlin Wall. And you might say, well, the Berlin Wall's in Germany. What does that have to do with the Soviet Union? So for my world history students, remember those Eastern Bloc countries, even though they had their own governments, they were really puppet states of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, if you can remember this from the reading, I know I haven't been there to teach you. I'm teaching you distance learning the best I can, and you're doing the best you can. But a little review is that when Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when those bombs fell, Berlin had already fallen. The European campaign in terms of World War II was done. But when Japan ended, immediately our ally, who was at the time the Soviet Union, they immediately became our enemy. And there was this race through Europe to kind of snap up countries and either make them pro-democracy or pro-communism. And ironically, it's a little more complex than this. If you go to the reading, you can get more detailed accounts. But basically, it was like they drew a line right through the middle of Germany, and the eastern side became pro-communism, and the western side became pro-democracy. Now, at the end of the Cold War, fast forwarding 40 years or so, there's a wall. There's actually a wall. You can't. You're driving down the street and you'll hit a wall. You can't go any further, and that wall falls. Now, what's I always find is kind of interesting and ironic is how could the Soviet Union say they have a better system when they have to put up a wall to keep people in? Part of pro-democracy nations, we have open borders. If you want to leave, you can leave. If you want to stay, stay. If you force someone to stay, it's probably not a good form of political ideology and applicable government, if you will. So this wall falls, And we're going to look at what that means when the people rise up from both sides and tear the wall down. Now, the key is as they tear the wall down, the communist secret police, the communist police on the eastern side, they let it happen. They no longer want this form of government. All right, so that's one of the longest videos I've made in a while, but hope you guys are doing well. If you have any questions about this stuff, shoot me an email. I'll get back to you. And if you're really confused, we could do a Zoom and I'll try to explain some things. Should be pretty straightforward. I hope you have a great week and hope you're doing well in all your other classes. Summer will be here before we know it. Thank you and have a great week.